Multicultural Affairs and Immigration Practice at the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. He serves as the co-leader of the department's Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team. Since 2008, he has spearheaded efforts to build the CTDCF response to human trafficking of children. Let me just get over to our presentation and give control over to William. Okay, William, you should be all set. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. So you have control and you should be good to go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura, and welcome to everyone. Again, my name is William Rivera, and Laura has already shared my title. I oversee the Sex Trafficking Response Team units with my colleague, and I'll talk a little bit more about our specialties and how we do this. But I also want to briefly take a moment to acknowledge and just put out there for the record that there is a team that works with me who does so much of this work. So this is not a lone effort by one individual or an administrator. It actually has been built based on the ideas and the actual experiences of a team that continues to work that are made up of Connecticut DCF employees. So I just want to shout that out for my team. What I'd like to do, if possible today, is I have a set of slides. I would like to go through those just to outline the chronology as well as the evolvement of our response over the last 8 years, but limit those to what our existing model looks like in the sense of where we are here on this particular date. I would also like to put out there that we have a lot of experience and stories and things like that that will not be addressed in this seminar, and I'm hoping to get through in 30 minutes for the slides or so, and then allow more time for questions and answers. So let me commence. Okay, Laura, I'm not moving slides now. I have no response here.
William, have you gone to full screen?
I'm looking for PowerPoint full screen. Yes, I'm on full screen. There we go. Thank you very much, Laura. Just as a basic, for many of you who are actually CPS or child welfare agencies, like you, your mission might be similar to ours. Our mandates are to protect children. The teleconference has ended. Hello?
William, we have the teleconference set up, but unfortunately we don't have the call feature. So we do need everyone to use their computer speakers, so we should be good to continue.
All right, thank you. So like many other child welfare agencies in the country, our role is to protect children, support and preserve families when that's possible, as well as improve child and family well-being. Unlike some of your states, which I've noticed as we've consulted around the country, our state is pretty unique as a child welfare system in that we have 4 mandates. We do all elements of the child welfare, foster care, child protective services, investigations of abuse and neglect. So we have that mandate. Then we have our initiative around behavioral health for children. We have juvenile justice under our mandate, which means we also run the Connecticut Juvenile Training Facility. And then a prevention mandate, which all fall under the purview of the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. We started looking at this some years ago as a concern that was emerging, but when our existing commissioner, Joette Katz, came on board in January of 2011, she determined that we would have 3 agency priorities, which you can see in front of you to prevent children, raise awareness about child abuse and neglect, public awareness of human trafficking is a child abuse and neglect issue. And in our state, human trafficking in any form is classified as an issue of abuse and neglect, and so that became one of our administration's priorities and is now integrated in standard operating procedures into what the department does, And then finally, the proper identification of physical abuse and injury of children by the medical community, given some, well, I would say a trend of fatalities of children who were actually seen by medical providers. So those became her administrative priorities, in addition to other things that we have to do by statute. From the Connecticut perspective, we at DCF Connecticut are charged with and responsible for protecting all children under the age of 18 from harm, and this includes victimization through means of human trafficking in all forms, both domestic and international. We're divided into 6 regional areas, and for a small state, you might wonder, well, that's pretty good. Some of our partners out there would find that our entire state may actually fit into one of your counties, but we are divided into 6 regions, and within those regions we have 15 area offices that are nestled in communities that are served throughout the state geographically in strategic positions. In addition to the facility or the 15 area offices, we have 2 facilities. One is the Juvenile Training Center. We have 2 sites for addressing the needs of specific hospitals, psychiatric hospital for children, as well as a residential placement, mental health, and comprehensive treatment facility for children. This has been important for us because it ensures that our staff are actually working in the communities and are able to respond to and assist to the children and families we serve. And that's going to be important later as we look at our regional structure, because we've established a continuous feedback loop, and one of the reasons why I think we've become more proficient in this area of responding to human trafficking or sex trafficking of children is because of our regional structure, which we'll look at shortly. Most of you know what a care line is, or a hotline, or an intake line. Briefly, we, in the last year, 2012 state fiscal year, we took in about 96,000 calls. Of those, 46,000 plus were reports of abuse and neglect, or suspected of abuse and neglect, and about 28,000 of those reports were actually investigated or received some type of CPS, Child Protective Service investigation. And same fiscal year, about 1,255 of the allegations were physical and sexual abuse, and they were substantiated as such. And 16,000 plus physical, emotional, and educational abuse came in, and those were actually substantiated and response merited. About 70% of all the reports come in from mandated reporters as per our statutes. Citizens, private citizens, concerned relatives make up the rest of that number, about 30%. But most of the calls come in from mandated reporters. And that's been important for us as our intake system, our 24/7 care line, has become the assessment and response center, as well as data collection center for all reports of suspected human trafficking in Connecticut, or depending on who it gets called in from, law enforcement or different states, the same intake system documents those. I wanted to talk briefly about legislation. Many of you as states are actually or have recently passed or are considering legislation, safe harbors, or any other combination of legislative initiatives to address human trafficking, if you will, or child sex trafficking specifically in your states. I can say that our first real piece of legislation came under our Safe Harbors Act in 2010, but as with many pieces of legislation, it was necessary but lacking in areas which I'll address. But it was necessary because it really became the impetus for successive legislations that have been refining and strengthening the existence for identification, public awareness, and prosecution of those who traffic children. Our biggest piece of legislation that was directly focused on the department had to do with law enforcement officers who arrest any youth or suspect any youth or have concerns of youth who are minors for prostitution must report these directly to the care line. And that was significant because prior to that time, if a youth was 16 or 17 years old, they were considered to be adults when they were charged with prostitution. And Connecticut has not delegalized, if you will, prostitution of minors as 16 and 17-year-olds, which is, interestingly enough, contradictory to the Federal Trafficking Victims Protections Act. But unlike the past, the patrol officers or the arresting law enforcement bodies could take the kids to a detention center, and they would not have to call TCF, even if they were minors, because they were charged with adult crimes. And so that law has resulted in all police officers who have arrested minors must call in the care line so that we can respond immediately, and I'll talk about that some more. We have some other acts that have been helpful, again, in our strengthening our responses, such as commercial sexual exploitation of a minor through internet and other means. And then finally, our most recent piece of legislation, which is very good for child welfare, as well as for law enforcement and prosecution, has been Public Act 13166, which is an act concerning sexual exploitation and trafficking in persons, with specific references. Well, there are different pieces. One has to do with prevention and public awareness, prosecution, forfeitures, but specific language related to children who are being commercially sexually exploited. I would have to share with you that many of the lessons learned that have brought us to this point were not intentional in their focus. So we had our first legislative initiative to form a task force in 2004, but it was in 2005 that the department began to train pretty extensively our investigative teams over a 3-year period on investigation, recognition, identification for trafficking victims, but our focus was very international. We were not looking at kids already in our system, nor were we looking at commercial sexual exploitation of minors, children who were already in our care that were on AWOL or runaway status, and during that AWOL or runaway status were being trafficked. But those were actually children who were already in the Department of Children and Families care. In 2008, we got our first call from our non-governmental organization after law enforcement shared some information about a possible operation. It was believed in the surveillance video that one of those victims would be a child. We were called by our NGO, and we met, and literally within 3 hours, we developed the first human trafficking response protocol. Now, for those of you who are just getting started, I want to just let you know that this has been a process, as you'll see in the next slides, but our protocol, created in 2008, has already been amended 44 times. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later, because I know that some of you may have deadlines, like 6 months, where you're supposed to have everything into place, but it doesn't work that way. In 2009, we established our first team internally to look at creating responses, policies, protocols, assessment tools. We worked for a full year with an interdisciplinary team that involved medical, psychiatric, legal, child welfare, foster care, and other disciplines, including myself as the immigration practice officer. And we then implemented that our first human trafficking policy and formal response protocols, which we today call trafficking or practice guides. In 2010, we realized that over 2.5 years we had no victims who had been called into us or we were identifying that had been from another country. There were no foreign victims. So while our system continues to be set up to accept those types of referrals, we realized that the majority of the children who had been called into the care line or were already in our system were domestic minors. And so in 2010, we almost quadrupled our training efforts. We identified mandatory training for our investigators, adolescent workers, and other folks who had high contact with minors to train them on how to recognize the variables as well as indicators that their kids under caseloads, as well as others who they ran into through law enforcement referrals, would be or were at high risk for sex trafficking. 2011, our response really developed further so that we still do international. If we get those referrals, I am the certification officer for services at the federal level. But again, all of our calls have continued to focus on domestic, and that really has been the focus of our existing model and team. In our training with police officers, because we do training for police officers jointly, our focus has been exclusively on domestic minor sex trafficking. Just to give you a quick snapshot from intake to this position, our care line in Connecticut, which is operated 24/7, is staffed by social workers around the clock. That intake line has become our means for responding to and making determinations of trafficking, as well as tracking data and risk for future follow-up. So the care line receives the phone call from whoever. All of our screeners on all of our shifts have been trained on human trafficking in all of its different forms. I wrote up a screening tool with actual cases so that they can kind of determine whether or not any of the language that's being called in or the indicators might be related to trafficking. The screeners determine if it's an appropriate human trafficking response, and then a time, which in our case is always immediate. Immediate meaning within 2 hours. Depending on the time of the day, those referrals get directly vetted to our area offices, which we have 15 of. After hours, we have specially trained investigators who work for the department and our social workers to respond if necessary, all within 2 hours. We have developed designated emergency department memorandums of understandings throughout the state by regions, and are continuing to do that actually, but we've also trained the ED teams on different shifts so that they have a good understanding of what these kids might look like when they come in. And we've also developed a very specific step-by-step protocol for mental health and psychiatric health and psychological health assessments. And again, finally, in that same vein, any report that comes in through the care line not only gets tracked, but we're able to then follow up on our protocol, which could last up to 6 days of follow-up. But if there are any other calls, so we didn't confirm trafficking as per the TVPA in this particular case, that child, if you will, is still in our record, so that if any additional calls comes in, it helps us in working with our law enforcement partners to connect the dots. Briefly, I wanted to just give you an idea. So since 2009, March 13th, we had a system for basically saying, I want to know how many kids have been reported for sex trafficking, and we have that capacity now. We have had 150 reports actually as of tonight, or I'm sorry, last night. That number is up to 158. The majority have been girls, as you can see, female, 141. Some males, which has been a new challenge for us because we were really thinking girls, so we've had to make some adjustments there. but probably not new information. The majority of the victims have been girls. What is some of the data that we've gathered over the last year since we started tracking? Most of our cases have been domestic minor sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, survival sex, but all meeting the criteria for the TVPA. Every single one of those kids, no exception, was on runaway or AWOL status. So they could have been AWOL from a foster care setting. They could have been AWOL from a group home, a residential setting that was not secure. They could have been on runaway status from their parents' home, who we had no involvement with whatsoever prior to their being referred to DCF. The ages have ranged from 11 years old to 18 years old, and the referrals have come obviously from various sources, which you can see here. What's been encouraging is that the more training we've done over the years, and actually not only with DCF social workers, but with our law enforcement partners and congregate care facilities, the numbers of referrals continue to grow. And so our response obviously has become more refined in our non-governmental agencies. I wanted to just put out there what our system currently looks like. So if you look at the top, there was a time prior to 2011 that the response to trafficking was centralized. So that's another way of saying that when the responses came in, either my colleague or I, Tammy Steen, the Director of Girl Services, would vet them, and then we would assign those to the area offices for a response. It probably doesn't surprise you that it got to the point where that became totally unmanageable, and we then drew the conclusion that given that our regional offices, teams, are actually going to eventually end up with the cases, we created a regional structure for responding to this. So every one of our 6 regions has a HART, meaning Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team. That's at the regional level. Each region may have 2 to 3 offices, and each office can decide if they want to have their own teams, but the regional Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team liaison coordinates, consults with all of those teams, and if there's ever a question about whether or not the child is indeed victimized, then they get back to myself. Each one of those regional liaisons has access to law enforcement, FBI, contact names if they need further assistance. The next slide really shows what our Human Anti-Trafficking Response Teams look like. So each office in each region has some flexibility about what works best for them, but the recommendations and requirement for each of those is that there is a multidisciplinary team and law enforcement response or partnership. So whatever team you have, you're going to have an NDT liaison on, law enforcement liaison. Judicial, we've worked a lot with delinquency, Attorney General's office, or public defenders. Our local boards of education, we've asked for youth, either a social worker or a liaison. Generally, those can be a school social worker. We leave that up to the regions. We have a clinical provider. Sometimes our EMS, Emergency Mobile Psychiatric. We have clinical providers who provide services for the kids once they're identified. We have foster care education and all of our pre-licensing training for foster care to raise awareness. And then we also are starting an initiative to train specialized therapeutic foster homes to take some of these kids if they don't meet the level of care for hospitalization or residential. So those are recommendations per team, but the law enforcement and NDT is non-negotiable. We've developed some partnerships, both internal and external, on our efforts to expand how we educate and equip our own staff. And again, most of this is being done internally with some external partners, We have a comprehensive 3-day training program. Every one of our investigators must go through that. Our adolescent workers also go through that. We have an outstanding training unit and a supervisor who's been assigned to do nothing but coordinate the training response to trafficking. We have awareness through our girls network provider that Tammy coordinates, who meets monthly and also looks into best practices around treatment. We've started a pilot man-up model in our juvenile training school for young men around this issue of commercial sexual exploitation of girls and women in general. And then we have a joint DCF CPS law enforcement team who meets once a month, and our focus is specifically designed to enhance the ability of a patrol officer to recognize children, provide her or him with resources, and then very specifically, because we work so closely, because any crime involving a minor must be reported to DCF, our law enforcement partners recognize that they have to call us or we have to call them, and as a result of that, we work very closely on developing training tools. What have we learned over the last few years? And remember, we've revised our protocol 44 times, and we're still doing that. It can't be a static document. We've learned that every case is different. Therefore, the response and the services also have to be individually designed for victims. Some of you who are working with victims already know that not all of the kids or youth who are identified as victims, whether it's through law enforcement or their parents or in the community or by the school system, is that they're not going to acknowledge that they're being victimized. So that in and of itself may determine the initial assessment and potential for placement. So the acuity level clinically might be very low, but yet the child eventually, over a period of time, and the reason why we track, might start later on demonstrating some signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, and also when they're involved in our My Life, My Choice group, which JRI has created, and we use Lisa Goldblatt Grace, then start disclosing. All of our reports are screened. Not everyone is an automatic accept. Many cases will require our teams to look below the surface using some of the federal language, connecting dots. And one of the reasons why our care line has been critical is that every report that comes in, so I can give you an example recently of one child who was called in, a 14-year-old, on 6 different occasions, but it wasn't until the 6th report was made that we were able to put together pieces of the previous exploitation that all added up to, this is a no-brainer, sex trafficking. We turned it over to the FBI, and within days, we had already had an arrest, we had interviews, and it's already moving to trial at the federal level. So that has really helped us refine to do more of the tracking, and then to talk with, and we meet regularly with our law enforcement folks, that we say, you know, this looks like trafficking, can you help us make that determination? And they've been great about that. Every case helps us learn something new. It's not static. We learn things all the time. We've modified our protocol. We've continued to build skills in these areas. For those of you who are thinking that you can do this on your own, or if you're a DCF or child welfare system, and you think that this is your problem, I hate to correct that, because it's not. This is a community issue, and we are not, as a DCF, going to be able to fix this on our own. So interagency systems responses are critical, and this is a very complex issue as well as a complex population. So start looking at the partnerships that you have. Great laws don't always mean that you have great practice. I'll give you one example. Our 2011 law for mandated reporting by police officers we continue to have to do police officer in-service training because even though we've had the law for 2 years, your patrol officer who's working the shifts 24/7 or the boots on the ground still are not aware of the law and the implications for them. So that's been a real priority for us. What do we do by way of wrapping up here? So in 2008, we started or responded formally to our first known case of human trafficking involving a minor child who was a U.S. citizen, domestic. Through those years to present, we developed, up to that time we had no policies for specifically responding to this. We had no protocols, we had no specialized services to serve the victims of human trafficking. And just as a parenthetical, for those of you in different states who are having, and this tends to be more of a legislative issue, the debate over the numbers and data. If you decide as a priority to make data, the impetus for whether or not you're going to create the system, you're probably not going to get that data. We decided in 2008, when I was tasked with building this response, was that we're going to look at training and identifying, and then as we identify, we would concurrently build the system or the continuum of care to be able to serve the needs of the kids. And so since then, our data has escalated, but we didn't wait till we had numbers, because at that point, no one had numbers because it was difficult for folks on legislative bodies, as well as within our own agency, to believe that this was a U.S. problem. I've shown you our infrastructure that we created, how it works, some of the elements of that. We've done a lot of work with public awareness. We've provided a lot of education. We've worked with subcontracted providers or organizations who are good at this to get at schools and other areas to just raise awareness of who these children are and how they are vulnerable, as well as how the public can respond, and then, of course, to call us. And then lastly, the developing of specialized services, and I say have been created, I really should say are being created for this population. I'm going to open it up to questions or comments, but before I do that, I wanted to give you contact information for myself, as well as my co-lead, Tammy Smead, who's the Director of Rural Services. I deal with the systems issues, law enforcement response and collaborations, the oversight for the training on this. Tammy was assigned to me a couple of years ago, phenomenal resource to look specifically at services to victims and girls, as well as working with providers on developing a continuum of care for responding to the needs of victims. I think that's all I want to talk about, and I'm going to open it up to questions and comments.
Great. Thank you so much, William. And before we get started on some questions that have been sent in, I just want to let everyone know that we may be able to offer opportunities for additional on-site technical assistance for departments working on these issues. If you have any requests, please send those over to Sam Webster at swebster@ncvc.org, and I will take that into the chat box in just a moment. So, William, your first question.
Yes.
Is your training of law enforcement for patrol, investigators, command, or leaders?
Ours has been the patrol officers. Actually, this morning we just had a meeting. It's mixed, so it's all of our trainers who do that is we call police officer standard certified, which means they get their version of in-service or CEUs, if you'd like to call it that. We have had training officers, which generally are sergeants and lieutenants, who have gone through those trainings, but most of them have been patrol officers and or their supervisors.
Thank you. Next question. Does sexual trafficking occur more in certain ethnic or racial communities than others? And is there data where trafficking occurs given race and ethnicity?
There is a lot of national data, but I can only specifically, because I'm assuming that the question is specific to Connecticut. I can tell you that with very few exceptions, most of our children who have been victims are either African American, Latina, biracial, and a small number of children who are white, white Caucasian by race. Now that shouldn't surprise anyone, given that many of the kids in care, and I'm not going to enter into a conversation about disproportionality of children in care in the child welfare system, but most of our children fall into those racial categories, and I think that's pretty consistent with what's happening around the country.
Thanks. Let me just scroll through and get the next question. Could you talk about the special services created and how long did it take before the police stopped charging CSEC youth with adult crimes and as perpetrators?
Well, good question. Let me just start off by saying the police in some jurisdictions are still charging minors for prostitution who are victims of sex trafficking. Since we've started with a lot of the training and things like that, more officers, and I don't have numbers because this is early for us, so we're looking at correlations between the laws and the police response. And right now we are working with, we just actually spoke with Dr. Dominique Roe-Sepowitz from Arizona State University to start looking at the impact training for patrol officers and arrests related to CSEC victims. And so what we do know already from some of the intake data that we've received is that more police officers are calling in our care line rather than arresting, and there is a correlation between those types of referrals and the training that has been done in those jurisdictions.
Thank you, William. And I just want to do a reminder before I get into the next question that if we do run out of time before all the questions are answered, we will be compiling them and hopefully getting a short fact sheet up on our website with the answers to those questions. So our next question, I would like to know what the average caseload for DCF workers is in your state, and also if DCF in your state contract their services out to private providers that do the same job.
Yeah, our caseload for each, actually they're different for different types of workers. So we have adolescent workers, we have in-home workers, we have different specialty units, I believe is the best way of saying that. So for the investigations we now call intake, their caseloads run between 15 and 18 cases. And then for our in-home units, so that's closed investigation, substantiated, moves on to the next level, it's about 23. None of our CPS services, so our child investigation intake, in-home units are subcontracted. The state of Connecticut Department of Children and Families does all of that, including our care line. I know that there's some states that we've worked with who have subcontracted intake lines. Ours is all done by the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. Our investigators or intake workers would also be the ones who would be primarily responding to immediately within 2 hours to allegations or reports of human trafficking in any form.
What does your partnership and collaboration look like with your local NGOs?
Actually, very strong. We have our non-governmental agency, so who receives federal funding for Victim Services International and adults, although I preferred some minors. But we meet every other month. So there's the Connecticut Council Against Trafficking, which is facilitated by the International Institute of Connecticut. And that pulls together local community service providers and other folks who are doing any type of public awareness, education, religious or private around this topic. Some school folks, Board of Education, state, And we meet every other month on a regular basis to get together, catch up, look at our initiatives, evaluate what we're doing. We have work groups that meet monthly, which are also an extension of that NGO oversight. But then whenever there's a case and we need to call each other, we just do that. Every one of our workers have those numbers, and the executive director and the rescue coordinators for that NGO and us communicate on a regular basis, and we also jointly train our law enforcement partners.
Can you elaborate on the makeup of the MDT and whether there are special HT MDTs?
We, excuse me, our MDTs, for those who are not aware, multidisciplinary teams, collaborations with police departments, child welfare, forensic children's advocacy centers, or other agencies, medical, who investigate or do a lot of the interviews, forensic, with law enforcement of victims of child abuse. So that's an MDT. So every one of our MDTs, and we have multiple throughout the state, have been trained, if you will, on human trafficking, not only as a 101 type of response, in addition to clinical aspects and trauma related to victimization. We meet regularly. So we have a statewide team, task force, and then we have local teams that work within or with each of our area offices. So that's 15 throughout the state. Again, they're multidisciplinary, service providers, law enforcement, generally a hospital or a children's advocacy center. You know, we look at best practices for going about assessing and determining whether or not, well, what are all the law enforcement and medical issues related to victimization. And the other piece that the MDTs have become good on, because this is all fairly new. So 2 years ago, we did not have the MDTs, or the MDTs, let me turn it around, were not looking at children beyond the age of 13 years old. That has changed since this initiative. So now if it's a minor, every minor who's a victim of sex trafficking in any form now gets presented before the MDTs, potentially for prosecution and the medical. But every team works together to look at all cases of sexual abuse of children.
What is your opinion on group homes, not necessarily residential treatment facilities, designed for girls who are or have been commercially sexually exploited? In Florida right now, there are providers approaching the department to build CSEC group homes.
Okay. That's a very good question, and I get asked it quite a bit. Actually, we all do. We do not have specialized group homes for CSEC victims. There are some, actually there are very few in the country. And if you've read anything by Elise Hopper and stuff coming out of JRI in Boston, they have a best practice framework, best practice minimally, because there's not a whole lot on this, for framing, if you will, or developing programming for CSEC victims. I'm working on my dissertation on this issue, so I can tell you that from a literature perspective, the jury seems to be, and this is one person's assessment, out on whether or not you want to have specialized group homes. So we have found, this is Connecticut specific, that when we have certain levels of group homes or residential facilities that are trained both clinically and recognition-wise, an environment where other kids are interacting with, and you have the treatment as well as the observation of recovery of developmental trajectories, girls tend to do better. I don't have any research, that's all anecdotal, but from my perspective, the jury still seems to be out about what is the best model for treating these victims. And the other thing I'll say lastly about that is this is a Connecticut experience, so I'm hoping that someone else will validate this. we have been very concerned about the number of experts who all of a sudden seem to be popping up to offer services to these victims. And again, what we have done, and this is a legislative proposal that we've put forward and has been approved, is the Connecticut Council Against Trafficking has been tasked with creating through the University of Connecticut a criteria, if you will, for screening providers to ensure their credibility as well as validation of the types of services that they would want to offer before they get approval to do anything in Connecticut. But the jury's still out for me. I can just tell you what we're doing now, but we have looked at that issue, and probably the Goldblatt, Grace, and the Elise Hopper article that's provided on the HHS website could give you an idea of whether or not that might be something we want to explore.
Would you mind sharing some key indicators that someone is a victim of sex trafficking?
Yeah, and I just want to put out that there's a lot of material, so Shared Hope International, Polaris, and others. But some of the trends that we have found pretty consistently, both on the internet as well as you know, the kids who we have in our care, many of you may know these. For instance, when children go AWOL, whether it's from foster care, whether it's from their homes, who we eventually get referred to with no DCF involvement, group homes, we found a pattern. The kids would leave for 2-3 days, generally by Sunday night at midnight. They would come back by curfew, but would be AWOL for 2-3 days. And they would leave with nothing but their clothes on their bodies. But then they would come back with clothes, nails done, different hairdos, braids, things like that. So that for us became a key indicator and resulted in our tracking more. Those are physical things when kids would come back. So if a child would leave and come back and there was some indication of hotel cards, a card by some person in the music industry, some person in the modeling industry. Actually, the girls, again, I'm speaking only of girls because this has not been true with the boys. They're excited. They met someone. They're impressed by their talents, their voices, their bodies, and so they try to recruit them, and that generally comes back with some kind of card or number. The telephones, cell phones. Many of our kids who've been victimized have some kind of information of their pimps or facilitators on their cell phones. When we find that, we turn those over to the FBI so that they can do searches and hits. Those are generally some patterns that we've been finding. Kids coming back, we call it branding. Some of you know what that means. They have no markers, tattoos, but then they come back with a tattoo that means they belong to someone or they have someone's name. That doesn't mean that everyone who has a tattoo is a trafficking victim, but those are the types of patterns that we see in kids with or under DCF care who have gone AWOL. But there's tons of material out there that we have also shared. We didn't invent any of our training. We just looked at what was out there. We took our experiences. We integrated it with real life cases. But any human trafficking, Shared Hope International, Polaris, to give you a pretty good framework of what a child who is vulnerable looks like. But sexual abuse, every one of our kids were sexually abused. That's another high-risk indicator. Severe abuse and neglect as children, another high-risk indicator.
Was there any legislation that required the agency to take cases?
No, we don't. Thanks. That's a good question because I know that there's some cases, some states. I was in Kansas a couple of weeks ago, and they have legislation that puts this under the auspices of DCF. So there's a mandate for taking cases. I know Illinois and some other states do. We do not have a piece of legislation requiring DCF to take cases of human trafficking. we do that within our child welfare mandate. So as I indicated earlier in the slides, if we have a child who's abused and neglected, human trafficking meets that criteria, we've created child abuse and neglect codes that are aligned with the definitions in the PVPA. So we take those cases under DCF reporting. So there's no legislation. And the other thing I'll share with you is for many of you, if you're broke like the state of Connecticut is, if you're a state representative or worker, administrator, we are doing all of this within existing allocations. And so one of the first things I had to do, everyone talks about looking outside the box. What I had to do was to kind of put that aside for a bit and look within our existing box in 2008 to look at what we currently had within our DCF response and mandates, and look at where we could integrate the work that we would be doing as a result of potential reports of human trafficking. So that's a long way of saying that when you have no money, there's no mandates or dollars attached to any legislation like this, you look at in your existing system, figure out which of those elements of your existing system are best aligned to respond to these cases. And my guess is, like Connecticut, is that you're going to find out that you're already doing this, but you're not looking at some of the cases as potential trafficking cases.
I think we have time for just a few more questions. So I just want to remind everybody that if we are unable to get to your question, we will be posting answers to those questions on our website sometime next week, hopefully. So you can also email your questions to William or Tammy or to myself or Sam, and we will get answers to you as soon as we're able. I also want to let everybody know that William will be doing a more in-depth workshop on this issue at our National Center for Victims of Crime National Conference, which will be held this year in Phoenix, Arizona from September 9th to 11th. And you can sign up and get more information about that conference at our website, which is www.victimsofcrime.org. So the next question, William, what is the state's response for minors that are picked up on unrelated offenses but found to be trafficking victims?
It's interesting because that happens often, and the children had no involvement with DCF. And so what we've done as a result of that is we've entered into a partnership with our juvenile arm, if you will, of the State of Connecticut Court Support Services Division, so juvenile probation, parole. So all of the training that we did with our own folks, we have since commenced with them. And so a part of that has resulted in, interestingly enough, so we share the information, these are the indicators, look at your caseload. As a result of that training, and this has only gone on for the last 6 months, so there's over 900 court support services, parole, juvenile parole, probation officers who work extensively with kids. Once they understand that what the framework is, they've looked at their own cases, and then they see that indeed their own kids have been exploited. They call us. They call the Department of Children and Families, and then we open investigations on those kids. Many of those kids have never been involved with DCF. Some of those cases result in no substantiation of trafficking, but the more we interact and train together, the awareness is increased, the calls on our end continue to grow. And what happens at the end is that we take the referrals and then we investigate, and if necessary, that becomes an open case in which we direct the services and working with the families about the issue of exploitation.
One more question. How are you servicing the transgender community? Do you believe there is underreporting of trafficking for this population? And can you please describe the approach that the unit who services this population uses?
An excellent question, because, yeah, right now, prior to recently, so last year when we had our first victim data on boys, so as of right now we have 7 and 2 transgender. We weren't doing anything because the focus was exclusively on girls. Since then, we have an agency in Connecticut called True Colors, which is has been a big advocate, not only legislatively, training and support services for LGBT kids and families. And we've entered into a partnership with them, which we've had for a long time, but we recently started developing training, curriculum, and a program, if you will, once kids are identified, because a lot of our kids who are homeless and runaway that we've had no involvement with generally fall in within that group, and they're highly vulnerable for exploitation. So we've just started putting together public awareness training, clinical training, and working with that support agency, True Colors. So we do a lot of work together around the public and services for those youth specialized needs. But we've just really started on that, and that goes back to, I would say, November of last year.
What do you think about going back to an orphanage system rather than using foster parents?
Wow. Well, given that our approach in Connecticut is completely antithetical to that approach, and I say we as an agency don't support that. As a matter of fact, we believe that kids need to be with family. So kinship care, keeping kids together with families when possible. We understand that that's not always possible. Kids who are with families tend to do better when we're talking about sex trafficking victims. When they get to the point when there is a disclosure, we find that they do better and they start, recovering. You can't say quicker, better when they're in a family type of situation. So we really have not found in Connecticut that warehousing kids in residential group home settings, orphanages, is really in their best interest. And so that's the Connecticut position. And I suppose that I could give you a bunch of studies that would support that, but we have not found that approach to work very well for kids in their best interest.
Great. Thank you so much, William. It looks like we're almost out of time, and I do want to be respectful of everybody's time today, so I don't want to go over. So I just want to remind everybody that we may be able to offer opportunities for additional on-site technical assistance for departments working on these issues. Please send requests to Sam Webster at swebster@ncvc.org. And also that William will be doing a more in-depth presentation at our national conference, September 9th to 11th in Phoenix, Arizona. Please visit our website, www.victimsofcrime.org, to get more information and to register. And I just want to say thank you so much to William for presenting this valuable information. It was really great to have so many people attend. Please send us or William an email if you want some more information, and we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on our website. So thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you in Phoenix this September.
Super.